Shalom and welcome to the Middle East Report. In this program today, we'll be marking Israel's 75th anniversary as a modern nation, according to the Jewish calendar, as we celebrate Yom Ha'atzmaut. Well, welcome to the programme, and my two special guests are good friends of the Middle East Report. They are Zalmi Unsdorfer, who's the chairman of Likud Harut in the UK, together with Robin Benson, as we mark Israel's 75th anniversary as a modern state. Zalmi, this is such a special occasion and such a special programme to mark Israel's 75th anniversary as a modern state. Just share with us where you think Israel is at 75.
Well, we have to remember that the Jewish state has been in existence for thousands of years. The state of Israel was created 75 years ago as a result of a dream by Theodore Herzl, who wanted to make sure that Jews would be safe in a Jewish homeland after persecution in all parts of Europe and other parts of the world. In that respect, Israel has fulfilled its mission. It is a safe haven for Jews at a time, unfortunately, when anti-Semitism is reaching the kind of heights that we were seeing before Nazi Germany got started. So in that respect, it is really fulfilling its selling proposition, and it's unique. I call it a game reserve for the Jews, because Jews have not been safe in other parts of the world, particularly Europe. The European soil is soaked in Jewish blood. And I know as a Jew, my father was in Auschwitz, my grandparents were killed in the Holocaust, lots of uncles and aunts and so forth. So I know very, very acutely how important it is that I can get on a plane tomorrow and I could be in Israel. That is very important here.
I can imagine. And Robin, you know, where do you think Israel is at 75 from a Christian perspective? Because essentially what we've seen over the past 75 years is God's faithfulness to Israel and the Jewish nation, and the ingathering of the exiles, bringing the Jewish people back into their land. And we've got to remember that this land was once desert and now it's blooming.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we are, I mean, Bible-believing Christians are constantly amazed at Israel's ability to be a light in so many different areas of life, not just bringing the land back to life, but all the technology, all the medical development, all of these technological developments that constantly flow out of the land and bless the rest of the nations. So for us as Bible-believing Christians, we see this as fulfillment of promises laid down in the Hebrew Scriptures, what we call the Old Testament, you know, going back centuries and centuries and centuries, foretelling the return of the Jewish people back to their land and the blossoming of the land, and God, I mean, God in some sense is engineering this so that His name is glorified in the rest of the nations. Now, we're at a point in Israel's history where things are a little ruffled, to say the least, you know, as we're recording this program. But setting that aside, nevertheless, Israel is a miracle because it's surrounded by millions of Arab and Islamic people who would love to see it obliterated off the face of the earth. But God has preserved the nation through all the conflicts that it's undergone since it became a nation state again in 1948, and it's there as a light to the nations still, which is what God intended it should be, and He's making that possible.
And Zalmi, before we talk about some of the great achievements that Israel's achieved over the past 75 years, and you alluded to this earlier in your first response to where Israel is at 75, and that is the time before the existence of the modern state of Israel, that the Jewish people were in peril. And you mentioned your father who survived the Holocaust, and his book is incredible, The Yellow Star. You mentioned the fact that the Jewish people didn't have anywhere to go to at times of incredible persecution. And we know with Jew hatred, it goes through waves. And at the moment, we are reaching unprecedented levels that can be comparison to the 1930s and 1940s, the rise of Nazism and fascism in Europe. And yet, today, there is a safe haven known as the Nation of Israel. So share with us really how the ideology of Zionism that was led by Israel's spiritual father, Theodore Herzl, translated political action into a kind of political and spiritual reality today.
Okay, so from Herzl's point of view, it was just for the safety of the Jewish people, that they should not be stateless. Zionism is the return to the land, the biblical land of Israel. That's a very different situation, because some, in the early days of Herzl's conferences and congresses, they were offered Uganda. And I've often wondered, I've been once to South Africa, and driving through South African townships and so forth, I just imagined what would have happened if Israel would have been planted in the middle of Africa. Africa today would have been the most world-beating continent you can imagine. All those minerals, all of those natural resources, and Jewish ingenuity, striving brains, in technology and so forth. Can you imagine if that had been planted in Africa? We'd have a very different world today, and there would be no poverty in Africa. But as things stand, it was about returning to our biblical homeland. And this obviously, you're talking about 1948 and the independence, but after 1967, that's when the real return to biblical Zion started happening. Our homelands of Judea, Samaria, those are amazing times. And as Robin quite rightly says, this is prophecy being literally playing out in front of our eyes. And in Scripture it says that the land will only provide produce for the people when they return. When we left Gaza, okay, Hamas planted rockets in the fields, but even in the fields, the vegetables stopped growing. But when the Jews had come to this complete sand hills of Gaza, Gush Katif, they were growing cherry tomatoes and there were greenhouses everywhere. So it is biblical prophecy. It can be seen, literally picked off the floors as you walk. You are walking on a yellow brick road when you go to Israel. If you have belief, that's the yellow brick road.
Absolutely. So let's have a look at this excellent video produced by CBN that looks at the influence of the great man himself, Theodore Herzl, the founder of modern Zionism, with his book called Der Judenstaat, the Jewish State.
Here at the highest point of Mount Herzl, the grave of modern Israel's most famous founder overlooks Jerusalem and the nation he fought so hard for the Jews to once again possess. Theodore Herzl, a refined Jewish gentleman living in Europe, saw a growing hatred of Jews in the late 1800s and feared the prejudice would never end. That's when he realized God's chosen people needed a safer place to live and sought to take them back to their sacred homeland.
Imagine where the Jewish people were 125 years ago. Broken, lost, wandering, homeless. And this guy, with piercing black eyes and a beautiful black beard and a real sense of dignity, says, we are a people, we have ties to a particular homeland, and the right to establish a state on that homeland. Zionism. We're going to return to Zion.
In an effort to keep Israel's history alive for new generations, professor and Jerusalem Post commentator Gil Troy has edited the 3-volume Zionist writings of Theodore Herzl.
He saw that at a time when the French were becoming more French and the Italians were becoming more Italian, and there was this amazing thing called America coming together, that it was a moment of nationalism. And in order for the Jews to be accepted, truly respected, they needed their own home. Unfortunately, there was this ugly disease called anti-Semitism, which too many Europeans couldn't get over. It traumatized Herzl. And he said, wait a minute, I'm not going to give in to despair, although he has his dark moments. I'm not going to give up. I'm going to find a way home.
Herzl, a journalist and playwright, wrote of a strong, confident new breed of people establishing this Jewish homeland.
The idea must wing its ways into the most remote, miserable holes where our people dwell. They will awaken, from their gloomy torpor. Then, activated, a generation of marvelous Jews will spring into existence.
He lobbied world leaders and assembled Jews from all over to Basel, Switzerland for the first World Zionist Congress. That set off a powerful Zionist movement and led to a prophecy.
August 29th, 1897, he calls together 208 Jews. And by the way, says, meet in formal dress, because we're dignified people. We're not losers. And he says, after that Congress, and he puts it in his diaries, but he won't put it in public. He says, nobody's going to believe me, but in Basel we founded the Jewish state. And 50 years from now, people are going to see that I'm right. And indeed, 50 years later, the United Nations on November 29th, 1947, voted to recognize that Zionist idea, that the Jews are a people, they have ties to a particular homeland, and the right to establish a state on that homeland. And a year later, so 51 years later, May 1948, Israel was established. And so he really was a prophet.
Activists began to push for a Jewish homeland, and thousands began moving to what the Bible called the Promised Land. The Jews had been scattered from here some 1,300 years before, and though many believed their ancient homeland to be lost forever, Herzl had faith.
Here's this guy leading this broken, scattered people, but he believes in the power of an idea. He believes that ideas are the force that can move history. Ideas are a force that can reunite people.
Although Herzl died in 1904, his influence helped lead to the 1917 Balfour Declaration, which endorsed the idea of a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine. Herzl's dream was well on its way to fruition. He'd always believed if you push hard enough, a dream, an idea, could become a reality. He wrote that this particular dream of a Jewish return to Zion must be made real.
It is as old as our people, which has never, even in times of direst misery, ceased to cherish it. The Jewish state is something the world needs, and consequently, it will come into being. And it has.
There we go. That's an incredible guy, Theodore Herzl, who founded essentially the modern state of Israel intellectually, and really birthed the idea that Jewish people need a state of their own. Of course, we know that this also fulfilled biblical prophecies as the Jewish people came home. Robin, just to share with you, we saw in that excellent video there, the kind of very short kind of history of Theodore Herzl, but he also had a lot of Christian support as well. So this endeavour of the modern state of Israel, its rebirth of as a nation as we celebrate its 75th anniversary, this is also a journey that many evangelical Christian leaders throughout the ages have also partnered with our Jewish friends like Zalmi to help bring about and support this Jewish endeavour to be re-established in the ancient covenant homeland in fulfilment of God's word. Share with us the role that Christian Zionists have played in helping the modern state of Israel.
Well, of course, you've got the Reverend Heschler, who was the chaplain at, I think it was the British Embassy in Vienna, if I remember rightly. Certainly who got alongside Herzl and for many years was actually supporting him and encouraging him, attended some of the Zionist congresses. And he had a deep understanding of biblical prophecy. And the sense is that in some measure or other, he was able to influence Herzl. We're not talking about conversion or anything like that. He was just there in the background, advising him, drawing alongside him. He was closely connected to the family. And that was part of a time and a movement in the history of the church, certainly in this country, where there was a heightened expectation of biblical prophecy possibly beginning to be fulfilled. But of course, 1948 comes along and things just sort of take off. And then, as Zalmi has rightly pointed out, along comes 1967 and the reunification of Jerusalem. And then the prophecy experts just, really latched onto that. And there was a whole widespread movement, certainly in the evangelical church, key leaders writing books, prophecy conferences, and that has continued right up until the present time. Now, there are various views on biblical prophecy that we're not going to get into here, but it's just that there has been, even tracing back to the days of Oliver Cromwell and the invitation for Jewish people to come back into the UK, There was among the Puritans, there was also a heightened expectation that God was going to, at some point in the future, restore the Jewish people. So there's always been that theme here in some segment of the Christian church, certainly since the days of Cromwell. Maybe before, but certainly since his time. And so we, again, as I said, in answer to your earlier question, we live at a point in history where, I suppose, in some senses, biblical prophecy is at a fever pitch. Some of it's helpful, some of it not so helpful, but there is that sense that God is doing something in Israel and the Middle East, restoring his people back to the land. And, people ask the question, how do you prove that the Bible is true? And it's an old chestnut. All you got to do is point them to the passages in the Hebrew prophets that speak about the restoration of the Jewish people back to their homeland, the blossoming of the land coming back alive, and say, read those passages, look at the newspapers, look at the media, see, God is doing this. And that should, for Bible-believing Christians, should be a reassurance that our God is alive and fully active in this world today.
Absolutely. Reminds me of the famous remark by Bismarck, the German leader, who asked, how do you prove the existence of God? And his response was, the Jews, Your Majesty. As the Jewish people have outlived every single world empire that's ever existed. But in terms of Zionism, which it was the political ideology of Zionism that was inspired by Theodore Herzl in the context of rising anti-Semitism in Europe, particularly the Dreyfus affair that happened in France, where a leading Jewish officer was accused of being a traitor, and it was all on trumped-up charges because of anti-Semitic generals that didn't like him. Of course, he was on trial. The whole nation of France then turned against him, and we saw really Theodore Herzl was covering this story for an Austrian newspaper, and then realised that the only answer for the Jewish people was to have their own state. But so we had the birth of political Zionism and its ideology, Zalmi, with Theodore Herzl. But at the same time as well, didn't we? We had Russian Jewish people making Aliyah to Israel who were inspired by Karl Marx and wanted to set up their own kibbutz movement. So the kind of first wave of Aliyah, 1882, went to what is now Israel, but was under control of the Ottomans to help build communities in Israel. So share with us how that dual track of the political influence of mobilizing support for a Jewish state politically in Europe in particular, and Britain as well, but also at the same time an organic movement started to develop of Jewish communities thriving again and living in the land again.
Well, the founding leaders of Israel, Ben Gurion and those that followed him, were basically socialists. They were socialist workers, effectively. And they came from Europe. I think Ben Gurion came from Russia originally. I think then he was in Poland, in Warsaw. But these were all socialist workers, effectively. And they brought this kind of socialist ideology to Israel. And of course, at the time, that's what was needed to build the land. Farmers, communes, kibbutzim, and all of this. That's what was needed. And it became quite an elitist organization. It wasn't particularly religious. Most of them, Ben Gurion was secular, and most of the others were secular. They wouldn't, in the Declaration of Independence, use the word God. They used the word Rock of Israel. There was a massive argument amongst the framers of the Declaration as to whether God should be mentioned or not. But it does go to show you, if you can't find God, if you can't find a place for God in the miracle of the creation of the state of Israel, you have a problem. And then this was then followed by what we call in Hebrew the Mapecha, the upset, when Menachem Begin and his right-wing party came into power in 1977, because that was the first time that the unwashed right-wing Sephardi kind of people thought were able to actually do anything. Ben Gurion in the Knesset would never mention Begin's the opposition leader by name. He would say, the gentleman sitting over there. That's how he referred to him all his life, all his political life. So that was a major change. And obviously 77 was 10 years after the Six-Day War. Religious Zionism was really in the ascendancy. And Begin was a social justice warrior. He brought lots of people out of poverty in the Sephardi and mainly the families that had come out of the Arab countries. Remember, about 800,000 Jews were expelled from Arab countries during 1967, and obviously in the war after the War of Independence. So we had enough of our refugees, and Begin mainly rehabilitated them. So it's been a very interesting journey, which started off with working in the fields and started off building the land, and you needed the socialist workers then, but then you needed to build up the religious and biblical, as Robin says, to be able to walk through the streets and the lands of Israel and actually see the miracle of prophecy playing out in front of your eyes.
Absolutely. And Robin, I remember reading Benjamin Netanyahu's book, Israel, A Place Among the Nations, when I was a kind of late teenager, in my teenage years. And what impressed me so much is what he said is that the Jewish people in Europe were denied being able to become landowners. They weren't allowed to cultivate land for themselves. And the only kind of work they were permitted to do was in the banking industry in the Middle Ages, and then all throughout the Reformation as well. But it wasn't until they actually came to Israel that they started to cultivate the land, and they became farmers. And when they became farmers, they needed to become soldiers in order to kind of protect the land. And I suppose that's the most incredible thing about Israel, is that Israel did so well agriculturally and also militarily, because there's that deep connection between the land of Israel and the people of Israel. So share with us really the significance of 3 years after the greatest catastrophe ever to happen and before the Jewish people, namely the Shoah, the Holocaust, and only 3 years later, the rebirth of the modern state of Israel.
Well, I think when obviously you've got the end of World War II, and you have, as the Allies eventually were able to expose what had gone on under Nazism and all of its allies scattered through all the occupied nations. I mean, it wasn't just the Nazis that were killing the Jewish population. They had plenty of help from locals in most of the nations that they occupied. And we know now from recent documentary evidence that the Allies knew this was going on a long time before the end of World War II. And so you have then the birth of the United Nations replacing the League of Nations and inheriting all that the League of Nations had already agreed. And I think, I don't think any other way to put it, the Allied nations had a sense of guilt. And the United Nations bore a sense of guilt over what had not been done to protect the Jewish population of most of Middle and Eastern Europe, Western Europe right through to the East. And out of that, rightly or wrongly, out of that was birthed the resolutions that gave birth to the modern state of Israel, or at least the possibility that Ben Gurion could then come on the scene with those that he were working with to declare independence. But it was only in the light of the British government's complete disaster of its occupation of then Palestine and its inability to, on many occasions to protect the Jewish population from Muslim and Arab aggression within the mandate. So you've got a real mix of events all culminating with Britain handing back the mandate, which it had abused and misused and twisted and turned for its own ends. Again, as history has shown us, handing back the mandate to the UN, effectively washing its hands of the mandate for Palestine. And out of that situation, Ben Gurion and those who've been working with him decided it's now or never. We need to declare a state. And of course, that's what we're celebrating this year.
Absolutely. And Zalmi, if we take our minds back to the days before the Declaration of Independence in May of 1948, Israel was potentially on the verge of being invaded by 5 Arab armies, in which he was. There was huge pressure of David Gurion, even with his own government and his own cabinet ministers not to declare Israel's independence. You had the American CIA and security services declaring that they only felt that if David Ben-Gurion declared an independent Jewish state, it would only last a matter of a week before there was another genocide. So share with us the kind of burden and the weight of Jewish history that was on the shoulders of David Ben-Gurion when he decided it's now, after the British mandate expired, that he decided to declare independence, despite knowing that this would trigger a huge Arab response in an invasion of 5 Arab armies to this new fledgling state of Israel.
By that time, he wasn't alone. Obviously, the underground, the Jewish underground, Menachem Begin, and the Irgun and Lehi underground, they did quite a lot to bring about the end of British rule in Palestine, as it was called. And of course, remember, the United Nations and the Allies, they reneged on the mandate and gave half of the land to Jordan. And even so, the half that we were left with, we've always said we're prepared to share with the local Palestinian population. But every single time we've offered them the opportunity to sit down and share it, they've refused all those negotiations. So, really, it wasn't just about Ben-Gurion. By that time, there was a whole nexus of opinion, and there was a very, very strong feeling that this was the moment. And even if 5 armies were going to invade us, there's an expression in Israel called "En Brera," we have no choice. Our wives and children are 400 years behind us, and if we fall, they fall. And that's what's kept us going, with the help of God, in every one of the wars that we have gone through.
So let's take us back. Let's take you back now to that historical moment back on the 14th of May 1948, where Israel's first Prime Minister, David Ben-Gurion, declared Israeli independence in fulfilment of biblical prophecy.
Here in Independence Hall, David Ben-Gurion declared the birth of the modern state of Israel. For the first time in nearly 2,000 years, the Jewish people had a nation.
He chose the words, "We hereby declare the establishment," it says here, "of a Jewish state in the land of Israel to be known as the State of Israel." This was the birth of a Jewish state, as for all Jews. Ben-Gurion was standing here as the voice of 11 million Jews around the world who had no voice, who had no address, and nowhere to go to.
I spoke with Isaac Dror, who leads the education effort here.
It was promised to us by God. We are the only people in the history of the world that live on the same land, speak in the same language, and believe in the same God more than 3,000 years.
We are in a historic setting here. Where are we and what happened?
This is the room where the Jewish state of Israel was born 70 years ago. In this tiny room with these same furnitures, a ceremony that lasted 32 minutes and shook the world.
As British rulers left Israel that day, 5 Arab armies invaded.
So it's like when you mix the happiest day for the Jewish people, one of the greatest moments for our nation in modern times, with one of the most dangerous and sad days when Israel was that close to a complete annihilation.
Why this building? Why here? Why Tel Aviv?
This building was simply the safest auditorium in the city of Tel Aviv.
Who were the people that were here?
Most of them people from around Tel Aviv, because they could not invite people from Jerusalem, because Jerusalem was disconnected. Only 350 of them were lucky enough to be squeezed in the room with no air conditions.
And among the crowd of witnesses was Yael Sharet.
Her father was on the stage here, Moshe Sharet. He was the right hand of Ben-Gurion and the kind of the foreign minister of the provisional government of Israel. And when they came to the ceremony, they came with an invitation. And it says here, "We are honored to invite you to the ceremony of independence." And then it goes, we ask you to keep it as a secret.
Really?
You don't want thousands of people to swarm the street when you expect an air raid later that day. And then it says the invitation is personal, like come alone. And here you have Mr. Moshe Sharet, who brought his daughter with him. And not only his daughter, but his sister as well. And Moshe Sharet said they will share the same chair.
I met Yael Sharet Medini at her home near Tel Aviv.
Here is my aunt, and this is my forehead. Hopefully there's something behind it, as I say. And we share the chair there, next to the wall.
She told me how just the day before, her father dictated and Yael wrote a draft of the Declaration of Independence.
This is my father's version of the Declaration. The one that he dictated to me, this is my handwriting. This is a photocopy of the original.
Yeah.
The original is in the archive.
And this took you how long?
I think that I sat there about 3/4 of an hour to an hour.
Yael simply calls herself a handmaiden of history. Well, how old were you?
17 and a half. I wasn't interested in this. I knew that this is what's going to happen from the age of 0, that we are going to have a state and we are rightfully here.
During that time, she and her family lived in New York, where her father would scour the United Nations, convincing countries to support the soon-to-be-born state. Do you remember the event itself, when Ben Gurion stood up and read?
It's epic. It's really epic. It's poetry, actually. The only time I was really moved, I must say, was when the Rabbi Levine made the old age Jewish blessing, Shechianu v'kiyimanu v'higianu lazman hazeh.
That ancient Jewish prayer, recited on momentous occasions, thanks God who has given us life, sustained us, and allowed us to reach this day.
I'm not religious, but this blessing has an echo of generations.
Did you sing?
Hatikva, yes. And then everybody stood up, and it was the anthem, the national anthem.
The very next day, which was the Sabbath, President Harry Truman became the first world leader to recognize Israel.
The Pentagon and the State Department truly believed that Ben Gurion, the leader of Israel, is leading the world into a new catastrophe. One person, however, thought differently. His name was Harry Truman. He understood something that most of his top advisors and ministers failed to see. This is truly a prophecy being realized.
70 years later, it's clear that Truman was right.
We are faster, better, prettier than ever today. The economy of Israel is doing wonderfully well, what they call a startup nation. And now we see Israel standing, and thanks God, together with the Americans, in the spirit of those countries who are leading. Suddenly people understand why we are here.
Scott Ross for CBN in Tel Aviv.
There you go. That's great looking back at history, that over 75 years ago that the nation of Israel was declared an independent state by David Ben Gurion, and now Israel 75 years on is stronger than she was back then 75 years ago. Share with us the challenges of the modern state. I mean, we're just showing in that video before, and we saw a little bit of a picture there of Abri Ban, who was Israel's first ambassador to the United Nations. He went on to become Israel's foreign minister and probably Israel's most articulate spokesman. And the nature of his role, because he knew something a little bit about international law and a little bit how the UN worked, even in his 30s, he then became Israel's ambassador to the UN and was formulating resolutions within the United Nations because he knew about it more than anyone else because he'd written a book on it. Just share with us the kind of challenge of being a state after Israel's independence, but being invaded by 5 Arab armies as well, and then having to absorb over 700,000 Jewish refugees from the Middle East, and still facing an economic Arab boycott, and the only produce that you can actually sell to the international community is oranges.
Yeah, well, the old expression was that, you know, if Moses had turned right instead of left, or left instead of right, I can't remember, then we would have had oil and the Arabs would have been left with the orange juice. You know, God has a plan, you know, for us all. Israel, fulfills a very important need, especially now in the world. I mean, you look around the world and you see what's going on, with church attendance is literally plummeting. Religious, people don't have time for God in their lives at all. It's all secularism. It's all TikTok. It's all very shallow. It's I was born a boy, but I can turn myself into a girl. I can do whatever I like. I don't need to be the person who God created me in whatever image. So it is clearly the lack of religion in the lives of ordinary people that is causing a lot of the rot in our society, especially amongst our young people. Israel is the Holy Land. It's the only Holy Land. It is the ground zero to all the monotheistic religions. It is the center of faith. And if that light goes out, and then we're all lost.
And Robin, when we look at the nation of Israel today and look back to those early days of Israel's nationhood when, American intelligence didn't actually believe that Israel would survive or last a week. And not only did Israel kind of absorb that war, but was able to repel those 5 Arab invaders. And we started to see the formation of the state and the regathering of the nations. Christians living at that time who understood God's word would surely be amazed to see that God is fulfilling his word in their time, to see that the modern state of Israel is being fulfilled in fulfillment of biblical prophecies from the likes of Isaiah, Jeremiah, Joel. This must have given the evangelical Christians who love Israel an incredible excitement to know that these ancient prophecies are being fulfilled before their very eyes.
I'm not so sure, okay? I mean, it's before I was born, okay? So let's be clear about that. I'm not so sure because I think probably in most nations in the late 40s, early 50s, people were still recovering from the after effects of World War II. And I mean, this nation was rebuilding itself literally from the devastation of German bombing and everything else. Looking back on it now, I suspect that it wasn't until 67, with the reunification of Jerusalem, that things really began to solidify in the minds of Bible-believing Christians that something was happening here. Because prior to that, Jerusalem was a divided city, and we probably were not that aware of what was going on, even though there were ongoing conflicts between Israel and its Arab neighbors right up until that point. But it was 67, because remember 67 was also the time of the Jesus movement in the States. And there are some biblical, Christian historians will make a connection between the two. But certainly that was a major turning point, because all of a sudden what was a divided city was once again back in Jewish hands. Now, the way that was handled, we look back and think, well, maybe it could have been handled differently, and we're still living with the ripple effects of that, all of these years later. But I think that was probably a more important turning point in Bible-believing Christians' understanding of what was happening in the Middle East. Because it was also probably a time when more people were exposed to the conflict through the medium of television. Because prior to that, folk they might have heard it on the radio, they might have read it in the newspapers. But I can remember, sitting in the room where our TV was at home, watching the black and white images that were coming out of Israel at the 67 conflict. I mean, I don't think I didn't understand it, but I just was aware that it was going on. And I think that probably was more the case. That was the thing that clicked in people's heads and spirits. This is different. This is a turning point in the history of this nation. Now they have their capital back together, reunited.
And Zalmi, I think Robin makes an incredibly valid point, a very important point, that the world took notice, didn't they, during the Six-Day War, particularly because Israel was surrounded by the Egyptians, the Jordanians and the Syrians who had signed a military pact. President Nasser of Egypt was saying, we will drive the Jewish people into the sea. And there was a real fear that another genocide was approaching the Jewish people, and yet we had the miracle of the Six-Day War. And when the IDF commanders that went through Zion Gate to liberate the old city of Jerusalem said, "Jerusalem is on our hands," that was not only a historical moment for Jewish history, but also this was probably one of the greatest moments in Jewish history, the liberation of Jerusalem, the holy sites back in the hands of Israel and under Israeli sovereignty. Share with us what that would have meant to Jewish communities around the world and also this newly established Jewish state of Israel.
We spoke earlier about most of the leaders of Israel being secular, but even the secular didn't believe how this turned out. They just absolutely were completely flummoxed by all this. And when they came to the old city and stood in front of the Wailing Wall, even people like Moshe Dayan, who was the defense minister at the time, had written some words there that showed that he was totally moved. You're talking about a totally secular person. But it literally, wouldn't say kindled the entire Jewish world. People were flocking there to be there, to experience what had happened. They'd seen it all over Life magazine and so forth. You know, there was, as you say, the black and white television. I remember as a teenager seeing the black and white television with this tiny strip of Israel, which was literally tiny at the time, and it was in all kinds of pieces because, you know, we didn't have the West Bank, we didn't have, you know, Samaria, Judea, Jerusalem. And there were like 5 black arrows pointing at from different directions. And you thought, this has got to be hopeless, completely hopeless. And they were digging graves in all the national parks because they thought there would be hundreds of thousands killed. So nobody believed this. And there was no other explanation than divine providence. And we've repaid that divine providence by the return to Zion and studying Jewish history and the Torah and planting our land as we're supposed to do, okay, and also being, as Robin says, the light unto the nations. And today, with, as I said, so much religion going down the drain, you know, we have an entire generation of kids who absolutely have no godliness at all, you know, in them. This is probably the last hope, isn't it?
No, absolutely. So let's look at this excellent CBN news report that looks back at those incredible days in the build-up to the Six-Day War in June 1967. And this is special tribute to the brave Israeli Air Force pilots that defended the skies of Israel. And thanks to their efforts, we see that Israel tripled in size and that Jerusalem again fell back into the hands of Israel and was under Israeli sovereignty.
In May of 1967, Egypt's president, Gamal Abdel Nasser, declared war on the State of Israel, telling his followers, "Our path to Palestine will be covered with blood." Nasser moved his troops into the Sinai Peninsula, expelled the UN peacekeepers there, then blocked the Straits of Tiran to Israeli ships. For Israel, it was time to strike or be struck. And for the next 3 weeks, the Israel Defense Forces were on high alert.
The atmosphere in Israel before the war was very tense. People thought we were facing total extinction. 40,000 coffins were prepared, and no one was sure that the IDF could really handle the Arab armies. 2 weeks after the birth of my son, I had to leave him, without knowing if I would ever see him again.
Armed by the Soviet Union, the Egyptians had the largest and best air force in the Arab world. Israel's only chance of survival was a preemptive strike. And the Air Force had prepared for this moment for more than a decade. Their plan was called Operation Moked, which means focus in Hebrew.
Operation Likud was the brainchild of Ezra Weitzman. He was commander of the Israeli Air Force. He was a pilot himself. He was a pilot in the British Air Force in World War II, flew Spitfires, later the president of Israel. And it was an incredibly daring program.
The plan was for dozens of squadrons to strike 11 airfields throughout Egypt and the Sinai Peninsula.
The main goal was to strike when all the Arab planes were still on the ground, fully exposed. And the idea was to bomb out the runways first to prevent any aircraft from taking off and to keep them from flying for a few days.
In 1966, the plan's creator, Ezra Weitzman, had been promoted to IDF Chief of Operations, and his successor, General Moti Hod, now had the task of executing Weitzman's plan.
Moti was the commander of the Air Force that kept on flying as a fighter. He understood what we felt in the cockpit. So he understood the issues. Brave man, the nicest person in the world. He had nerves from a metal and always thinking forward, ahead, like he did on the time to attack Egypt.
For Israeli civilians, the pre-war tension was high. But for Air Force Squadron Commander Yalo Shavit, Israel's victory was inevitable.
The Israeli Air Force is like a tide spring, ready to somebody to cut the cable that prevents it from. It will be done in no time because we've been trained since the last 11 years. I told my wife, go to Gedera. Gedera is a small village in the south. Find a small toferet, a lady tailor. And you know, what do you want to wear for parties with all the who's and who's, Prime Minister and down? Have 3 sets. Why 3? I said, because I'm telling you to do 3. There will be parties. He says, you're crazy. I said, listen to me, go and do it. She did it. She was the best woman dressed in the parties.
Israeli intelligence had spent years gathering details about the Egyptian targets. From the location of each plane to the name, rank, and even the voice of each pilot.
I was one of the youngest pilots in the Air Force. I had graduated from pilot training the year before the war. I wasn't even 21 years old yet. I was the intelligence officer of the squadron. For 3 weeks, we learned the most accurate intelligence we could learn. We also prepared the combat doctrine for attacking airports. I was a part of that system.
It was so confident that they know exactly what to do. They trained so many times, they knew it with closed eyes. To receive an aircraft with empty fuel tanks, with empty munition, with empty whatever. And they got to a record of 8 minutes. 8 minutes to prepare the aircraft to be ready to take off.
And you know what they say, the rest is history. And in regards to that, the Israeli Air Force carried out more sorties than any other Air Force has ever done in military combat to completely wipe out the Egyptian Air Force, win air superiority, to allow Israeli ground forces to take control of the Sinai, to liberate Jerusalem, Judea and Samaria, which is the biblical heartland of Israel, and also take control of the Golan Heights. Zalmi, unfortunately, I wish I could do another hour of this program, but we've only got 5 minutes left. So despite Israel's incredible achievements, and we haven't even discussed Israel's innovation, Israel's startup nation, the absorption of Israeli communities across the world that are back in the hands of, back in Israel, the rebirth of the Hebrew language, Israel becoming a kind of military, economic and political superpower in the Middle East. All these incredible achievements, and yet we still see strife in Israel. Where do you think Israel is today, 75 years on from independence?
Israel is a vibrant democracy, in spite of recent ructions where, you know, an unelected upper house of parliament, which is the judiciary, has to be brought back into in its place to balance out the three branches of government. But apart from that, all these riots and demonstrations that you see, they're not riots, they're demonstrations, waving Israeli flags, all very patriotic, are really just a passing phase. You know, to me, the more important demonstrations were when Jews were evacuated from their homes and cemeteries and synagogues in Gush Katif, in the Gaza Strip. That's what counts. Oslo, giving up vast areas of the homeland. Those are things that I believe should be the biggest things to be demonstrated. But where is Israel now? Israel is unbelievably successful in its economy, in its technology. It is ranked as the fourth happiest nation in the world, even though they have these things going on all around them. Threats from Iran, terrorism, and all this kind of thing. But they are happy people, they are happy in their land, they are exceptionally innovative, partly because they all have to go into the army. And you know something, I often think that if in England, in Europe, in America, if kids had to go into the army at the age of 17, 18, they'd come out very, very differently to what they are now. They wouldn't be a TikTok generation, they would be an innovative generation. They would be a disciplined generation. They would have respect for elders, respect for rules. That's what they would have. Fortunately, we have that out of necessity, out of the fact that we're surrounded by enemies. But yes, it's stronger than it's ever been, and its best years are still ahead.
Absolutely. And Robin, where would you say Israel is at 75, and how, you know, Christian Zionists have partnered with this endeavour, which is the modern state of Israel, which is a light unto the nations?
Yeah. I mean, I agree with Zalmi. You know, what we're seeing at the moment as we're recording this is it's a major blip on the landscape, but it will pass. And the more important thing for Bible-believing Christians is to hold onto the facts as laid out in the scriptures of what God promised he would do and what we are seeing him do. And as far as where we stand at the present time, yeah, we should look forward to celebrating the 75th anniversary of the re-emergence of Israel as a modern nation state. But also we as Bible-believing Christians should also be praying that the God of Israel will, figuratively speaking, knock heads together and help the two sides, the two major sides in the current stresses and tensions come to some amicable agreement and then be able to set aside all the tensions that there are at the moment and move forward. I think that's a key thing that people should be praying into at the present time.
Absolutely. And also, how will you be marking Israel's 75th anniversary, which is the Jewish festival or Israeli festival known as Yom Ha'atzmaut, which is Independence Day?
It would be nice if I could be there. I haven't yet made plans, but it would be really nice. It's a wonderful celebration, not just of the fly past of the Air Force and so forth, but it's just, you know, it's jubilation in the streets. And it's also the day after the Remembrance Day, which is unbelievable. I don't think there's a single other country where literally the entire motorway system and road system comes to a complete standstill. People get out of their cars on a major highway when that horn goes off. You know, so there's a deep understanding of where we came from and where we're going.
Absolutely. Robin, Zalmi, thank you so much for being my guests on the Middle East Report for this week, and particularly as we mark Israel's 75th anniversary as a nation reborn. Been excellent guests, so thank you so much. And I want to thank you for watching this programme at home. We can be so pleased that God has fulfilled his promises to Israel and the Jewish people. We've seen the fulfilment of biblical prophecy over the past 75 years and God's faithfulness to Israel and the Jewish people, that Israel was once a desert and now Israel as a nation is blooming. Israel's main export when the State of Israel was declared was oranges. Now she exports companies through Startup Nation and Israel's incredible innovation. We see that Israel is making massive differences in Africa and Asia through innovation, help with irrigation and water. And so as we mark Israel's 75th anniversary, according to the Jewish calendar, we do realise that Israel is a light unto the nation. So thank you for watching this week's edition of the Middle East Report, and happy birthday to the nation of Israel.